Hi and welcome back to this series on creating our core data API. Okay, so in the last lecture we went through and we created our SQL repository using an interfaces, and we created our first controller, and we're ready to start hooking that up now. So this base API control that it's created for us has some standard getting. So there's a get collection, get by ID, post, put, and so on. I want to update these, so these are returning, for example, strings and void and things, and I actually want to use iHTTP and also tell it to use our iRepository for actually storing the data in the database. Again, I've got all this in here, so I'll go to column patterns again. It's going to the web API folder and the sample controller. So again, let's just copy all that there, and where we've got sample model, update that to use our application model that we've just created using codedata.models, and also the contracts folder. Okay, again, so let's just copy and paste this. It's application. Let's also need to go through most of these, actually infer the object that we're using, so we don't actually need to update them except for a couple. There's the post and the put. And then the rest is fine. So again, all this sample code just gives us a set of standard actions. We've got get all that retains a list of objects, get that returns a single one taken in an ID, post that will create a new object, put that updates an object, and delete that will delete an object. And then at the top, what we say is we define a private internal class that's just, again, so we're using iRepository application, so we're using the interface, and then in the constructor for our applications controller, we tell it that we're going to be injecting an actual iRepository, and then we just tie those two together. And then the Unity NuGet packages that we installed earlier that added these Unity configs, combined with this line in the Unity config, means that when MVC runs and we hit this controller, it'll come across this. It says we want that to be injected. It'll go and check in our Unity config to find out what actual class to then go ahead and use. Once that's done, what we need to do is go ahead and add our web config. So we need to add a connection string in our web config. So when we installed Entity Framework, it added this section Entity Framework in here to tell it that we're using that. But what we don't have is any actual string. So again, I always forget exactly what the syntax is. So again, in my web API folder in the com patterns, we've got a sample web config in here. The bit we want this is connection string, so let's just copy that and just put that above the app settings. So let's have a look. Data source. Now I've got it set to local host. It really depends on where your SQL Server is. A lot of people, if you've installed SQL Express using the default settings, that will need to be localhost / SQL Express, but I don't do that. Initial database, let's give it a database name, so we'll call this core data. For this demonstration purposes, we're using integrated security, so that's fine. What I'm going to do now is just copy those connection strings again, and I'm going to add that into the app.config of our SQL repository. Now, technically, we shouldn't need to do this. But I find it's just a bit easier because when we use Entity Framework to create our database, it helps if it has this connection string in both, because otherwise you've got to make sure you've got the correct project set here and this, that, and the other. So I just find it easier to do it that way. So with that done, what we can go ahead now is go and create our database. So we're going to use Entity Framework to this, but we're going to use the Package Manager console. So if your Package Manager console is not there, you just go to View, the Windows and Package Manager console. We need to make sure the default project is the web, is the actual SQL Repository project, because that's where our migrations are going to go. And again, if that is highlighted, that's the startup project, it will use the web config from there. That's why I sometimes update the app config in here. Now actually I've just realized that this development box is set to SQL Express. Let's just update that in there, and again in the app config. I'm going to check on my database. So at the moment I've got some databases in there, but none of them are called core data. That's fine. We're going to close this down, and the first thing we're going to do is enable migrations. So that creates a configuration file in our SQL repository in a migrations folder. So the next thing we want to do is create our first migration. So add migration space initial. You don't need to call it initial, I just always call it initial for the first one I ever create. This then scaffolds out our database based on everything it found in the data context. Now what sometimes happens when people get problems with this is they might find it's not created a table, and that's because it uses this data context and these DB sets to understand what models we want to hook up, because you don't always want to hook up every model to the database. You might have view models that we will be using ourselves later on. So if you find that your migration has skipped a database or hasn't created the database, you just need to go back in and make sure that those models are hooked up to a DB set in there. So with that all done, we want to go into back to our package manager console and then run update database, and this will then execute our initial migration and create the database and the tables that we need. Okay, let's go back into our databases. Let's just hit refresh, and there we can see we've got our core database now with our applications, data models, data properties, and so on and so forth. So with all that done, what we should be able to do now is go ahead and build our application. View in browser. So the page it takes you to is going to throw an error. That's because this is a web API and doesn't have any pages to display. But because of the project that we created it with, it installs something called Swagger. And Swagger allows us to go ahead and actually test the API. So in the browser, just add /Swagger on the end and hit enter. Okay, if you still get an error, just go in here and go into this Swagger config, and you want to look down this one here, enable Swagger UI. So just delete that one there and that one there. Just save and rebuild the solution. Okay, and then go back and again just hit refresh on your base URL /Swagger, and then this takes us to a set of pages that we can use to actually test what we've done. Now it'll show you groups for each of the controls you have. So we've got in here the standard controller that you get when you create this project. We can ignore that. The one we want to test is this applications. So if we click on it, it expands and we can see each of the different endpoints that we created, the get, post, put and so on. If we go to the first get one, so what this should do is return us a list of our applications. So if we click the try it out button, so that's going to go across to the database and try and enumerate all responses, all objects. So we can see response code 200, which means it was successful, but the response body is just an empty array because we don't actually have any data in the database. So let's go ahead and create one. So to create some data, we would need to use the put post command. So expand that post. And we'll see over here the model schema that it's inferred from the database. Now if we click on that, it copies it across to here. We can get rid of the ID line because that is going to get generated for us, and then in here we'll just create an application, so application name, and click try it out. Again, if that's worked okay, we'll get a response showing our application with a generated ID, and again a response code of 200. And if we go back up to the web API and the get there and click try it out, again you'll see now that we've got a single object with the ID there. Let's just copy that. Again, if we just went into the get/ID, go ahead in there, and because it knows it wants to take an ID, we can paste our ID in there, try it out, and again it goes off and gets our individual object for us. First controller created, our applications controller, and it's hooked up to the database and everything's working as we were expecting. In the next video we'll go ahead and add controllers for the other models, and I'm going to show you a quick way we can do that using again the generics and the repository that we created in this one. If you want to learn more about the details of what we've done in here, specifically around the generics and repository pattern, check out my training courses that I have at www.completecoder.net. In particular, we've got the real world ASP.NET development course where I go in step by step how to create those controllers, how they work, how to use Entity Framework in much more detail, and so on and so forth. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.